Okay.
All right, live.
We're live. Hello.
So I'm Dave Greggs, right under the provisional nominal Christmas night at the Grand Commodore blog, and I have yet again been graced with an interview with major players in the OSR landscape. And so today I'm talking to David McGrogan, Noisms of the Monsters and Manuals blog. And so, David.
Hello. Yeah, it's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to being interviewed.
So just some of the finer points or some of the big, efforts of your, I don't want to say your career, but of your personal creative output. The big slugger, the big heavy hitter, which I've been reviewing in recent days, is Yoon-Suin. It's a pretty marvelous jewel, pretty marvelous thing to dive into.
Well, thanks very much. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, I'm trying to avoid becoming known for just that. One of those bands who just release one album and then spend the rest of their careers trying to resurrect the creative juices or whatever. I'm trying to get beyond it somehow.
Right. Something to fight, I guess. I mean,
yeah,
in a good way.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I really enjoyed doing Yoon-Suin, and I really like it. I think it sort of does what I wanted to achieve, or does what I wanted to, what I kind of set out to do. But yeah, after a while, you just want to do different things. You have different ideas, don't you? So you want to pursue the next project. So yeah. So but part of that is like improving on Yoon-Suin a bit, because I do want to finish off. I think one of the criticisms or the comments that people make about it is that it's kind of like the setup for a campaign, right? But there's nothing really concrete that you can kind of like just take out of the book and run with. You have to do a lot of prep beforehand. So in the new edition, I'm making a second edition. It's going to be a Kickstarter at some point in the next couple of months. That's going to have like adventure sites within it as well. So it's going to be, the original plus extra. So I do want to kind of finish it off with a flourish, if you know what I mean. Before then, kind of, thinking about the next projects. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. So going back so I want to ask questions in the order that I thought of them, just maybe stacked up in my subconscious in that way. So
yeah, okay, yeah.
Clear the air and clear the stack and get that stuff out. So my first question, and this is before I want to ask you a little bit about your life before beginning to write role-playing games, because like your development as a child, going and everything that you do, builds up and affects whatever your current output is. And so I ask about your role-playing experiences as a boy, and then, your travels and whatnot. But first of all, this is something I'm very curious about. So one of the more striking aspects of your work, at least looking at it broadly, is Animal Man.
That's true, yeah.
Ubiquitous, unusual, they're not all like Squirrel Man and Rabbit Man and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Unusual, Animal Man, and sort of like interesting niches for them. And so I'm curious, you don't see it very often, but when you do it, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like why you're doing it, how it would play out. And so I just want to ask you about that, and where where that came from, how you pick them when you run, and all of that. So.
Yeah. Well, where they come, or how I would choose like a type of quote unquote man to put in a particular position. That's just intuitive. That just seems to like come to me. I don't know why slug men in particular, suggested themselves, or crab men, but once they did, it just seemed to kind of make sense. It fit. I think that well, partly I think I hadn't really thought about it since you asked that question, but obviously now that you've asked it, then it does make a lot of sense to me that that is true. That there are a lot of men, quote unquote, animal men. I think partly it's just interested in the natural world. I'm very interested in animals to begin with anyway. You know, I think if I could have like my life again, I would have liked to have been a zoologist. That was what I wanted to be when I was a kid. And I went down a completely different path, but, you know, I often kind of like still think like, you know, that would be a nice career. I'm still interested in animals. I'm still interested in going out hiking, you know, all that kind of thing, the natural world. So that certainly informs part of it. I think reading a lot of animal fantasy books as a kid, you know, I think the Redwall books. I don't know if you know the Redwall books. Yeah, were they big in America? I always thought they were kind of like a British thing, but
No, I had
they were big. Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah. And there's one. I don't know if you've heard of Dunstan Wood. Have you heard of that?
Yeah,
I think that might be more of a kind of, I don't know why, but Britain seems to produce a lot of animal fantasy books. But the Dunstan Wood ones, they're worth reading actually. Dunstan Wood, Dunston, Dunstan Wood, and they're worth checking down because they're kind of they're about moles, which makes it sounds kind of ridiculous, but unlike in Redwall where the characters are just kind of like people but with furry costumes, in Dunstan Wood, the guy actually went to quite a considerable length to kind of think out, well, what would intelligent moles do, you know, if they could communicate with each other, what kind of society would they create? And they're really violent books. So they're not what you think of if you think of kind of animal fantasy. But I read them. There's loads of them as well. Loads of these books as a big series. So I was obsessed with them when I was about 11, I think. Yeah, so I was interested in that, interested in animals, and I think also just wanted to get away from, you know, orcs, goblins, hobgoblins. Like, what do you think of as alternatives? It's hard to really think of anything that isn't juxtaposing an animal with a human being, I think. Or at least it was hard for me to think of other things. So I think there's kind of a natural, when you're kind of trying to think of new ideas, your mind just kind of casts around for, you know, inspiration from somewhere, right? And so I think it just, yeah, creating a new kind of animal person kind of comes from that place. So I think yeah, one of the products I've got that I'm working on at the moment has got lots of different types of bird people in it. So it's like magpie men, crow men, ravens, wrens, like different kind of birds, different covids and things like that. Yeah, I'm quite interested in kind of the anthropological. There's an interesting space between a human being and an animal, right, where you can hopefully try to combine both. So the thing that you're creating is not really a person exactly, not really an animal, but like a kind of amalgamation of the two, you know, and can you do something interesting with that? So yeah, I guess that's yeah, that's what I try to do, or that kind of hooks me.
Yeah, completely. If you're using human beings, then you can get kind of fantastical with it, but there's still underlying expectations for what, you know, people are like and
yeah,
what
exactly.
their limits are, and you can bend those a little bit with animal people without being pigeonholed by the expectations of using, like, you know, orcs or drow or something like that. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you know, one of the I had an interview once with I think it was Orson Scott Card, but he was saying that he made the observation that I think is true, that people, so Tolkien, you know, wrote his books, and obviously lots of people really enjoyed them, but they made the mistake of copying the wrong thing. So what they copied was the furniture of Middle Earth, like that they call, okay, orcs, goblins, trolls, dragons, you know, they kind of took the superficial elements and copied that, when what they really ought to have done is copied the process that he went through, right? You know, they should have copied the kind of approach that he took. That was really the proper thing that you should be kind of aping, if you like. If you want to ape Tolkien, it shouldn't be taking his furniture and doing something different with it. It should be adopting his process and coming up with your own kind of equivalent to what he created, right? So I think just picking up orcs and saying, right, okay, we'll have orcs in this campaign setting, just never really appealed to me. It doesn't really I don't know, just why, that was his idea. That's what he came up with. You should really be thinking of something else, whatever that might be, right? And it's hard, obviously, to think of things. He thought of things he thought of the things that he thought of because he was an expert in, kind of Northern European mythology, right? So that's where he drew from. I'm not really an expert in that, but I can be interested in animals, so that's where I can draw some inspiration from, right?
Makes sense. Yeah. All right. So going back to the beginning, I want to ask you about when you were a boy, the things in like when you used your imagination. I don't know if you played with toys or like games with kids, things like that.
Yeah.
What kind of things did you see in your mind, or what kind of things came out of it, and how does it? Can you see the fingerprints of that on your current work and your current imaginary?
I think probably you're right, but it's quite hard to. It's very hard to remember, isn't it? The kind of the details of what you used to play when you were a kid. But what I do remember is that I think I was quite lucky in that I had very creative friends who weren't. I mean, we did the normal things that boys do. We played football, soccer, as you would call it in the States, cricket. We ran around in the streets. We went on bicycle rides. We climbed trees, those kinds of things. But we also did a lot of, I don't know why, but just happened to meet friends who were very interested in drawing things and writing things. So even when I was about 7, 8, that kind of an age, I had friends who, we just used to hang out and draw things together. And I think being young boys, I think the things that we used to draw were often, well, it was usually people killing each other or explosions and spaceships and things like that. But I do remember, various. I think even at that age, we were thinking about different ideas. Drawing. Like I remember drawing pirates. Like me and my one particular friend, we would sit down with A3 pads and draw lots of pirates, like a collection of pirates, or we would maybe take inspiration from Star Wars, the kind of things that we used to watch, and kind of draw things from that. And then in school, about 9 or 10, we used to do creative writing, like I guess a lot of kids do. We used to write little stories. But I had another friend who, we both decided, why are we writing short stories for class when the books that we were reading were long, like 200 pages or 300 pages. Why don't we try doing that? So we used to come up or try to write novels, and we didn't succeed in writing anything particularly long, but it was in our heads that we could do that, that kind of possibility was open to us. So I think I was just lucky that I had people around me who were kind of instinctively creative. And I think probably that influenced things more than anything else. Like it made it legitimate to just sit around imagining stuff and writing it down or drawing it, where I guess if I'd been in a different friendship group, we just wouldn't have been doing that. So I think there's just kind of like a lucky element to it in that respect. And then also discovering fighting fantasy books, because fighting fantasy books were huge when I was about 9, 10. They had them in the local library. All my friends' big brothers were reading them, and so the fighting fantasy books kind of that drew me more than anything else into kind of thinking about fantasy, because I had read The Hobbit and I read The Lord of the Rings, but the fighting fantasy books were the real, like, the gateway drug. Do you know what I mean? They were like the real the real deal in terms of being an adolescent boy and, like, wanting some kind of excitement from what you're reading. I think the fighting fantasy books were where it was at. Yeah, they felt more grown up than Tolkien, even though now looking back, like, they clearly aren't. But I think the level you engage with them when you're 10 or 11, they felt more grown up to me at that point. So I think they were the point at which I really sort of got interested in fantasy literature.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. I was gonna say it's like in terms of a fertile ground for like later creative development, that's like the soil of Ukraine. That's
yeah. And I think you're gonna come to this, so I don't want to sort of preempt the question too much, but I think there's something about, I think I must have written a blog entry about this years and years ago, but I'm from like a very I'm from Merseyside, and I'm from kind of a very Merseyside being kind of Liverpool, the greater Liverpool area. And where I grew up, there wasn't really a lot going on. It was, I don't know, for an American audience, if you can imagine it, but you're growing up in like terraced housing or semi-detached housing. All there is houses and pubs, like nothing else really. A park, and a beach. Nothing really for kids to do. Not at all like a privileged background, like a very kind of rubbish school. No real prospects particularly. And a lot of the people who grew up in my hometown are still there now. They haven't really done anything with their lives. It's not really like, it's a kind of a dead end sort of place. But just being able to think about imaginary things was like your gateway to freedom, because you're not bound in any sense, are you, by what you can imagine. And I think there's something about being from that kind of a background in the north of England, where there's not really a lot going on, where everything around you is quite grey and it's raining all the time. It's it's kind of it can be quite a bleak sort of place to grow up. Not in a bad way, not in a very dangerous way, but just in a very boring sort of way. And so having that opportunity to think about fantasy worlds, that makes a big difference. If you're quite a bookish sort of a kid, it makes a big difference.
Right. So sort of a pop-up question about that. So given that the environment itself wasn't necessarily that stimulating, and then maybe as a result that was stimulating in its own way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was there, so you mentioned the fighting fantasy books and that being sort of like normal in the milieu. What was the sort of like societal intellectual superstructure like around this kind of thing? So like what you were learning in school, what adults would talk about, or what was available in books and whatnot, what was in the public libraries, how was all that for supporting, this imaginative enterprise?
Yeah. Well, actually, I've been kind of thinking about writing a blog post about that very question, actually, because I've been thinking about that quite a bit, mainly because I think, if anything, there was no intellectual superstructure at all. And I think that in its own way, because you alluded to it just earlier on, I think in its own way, that can actually be a spur to creativity, because nobody I knew had gone to university, and the parents of everybody I knew, nobody had gone to university, right? So it was if you're calling it if you had a class kind of dynamic, it was very like the bottom of the middle class, if you know what I mean. It was kind of like my grandparents were all from poverty, if you know what I mean. They were just working in factories, right? Then my parents were like the step up from that. They were the kids who'd gone to school in the 60s, high school that is, and managed to get into a kind of low-level clerk office job kind of a thing. And my generation were like kind of the kids of that generation. So we're kind of at the bottom of the middle class, just above, like a step above poverty, if you see what I mean. And so there's no kind of like intellectual stimulation really, apart from maybe, if your parents were kind of like autodidacts, maybe they were interested in books and things and films just because, that's just, they'd grown up in the 60s and that kind of thing was in the air. So my dad was a bit like that. My dad had lots of books. He'd never gone to university, but he was always reading things. So that was kind of a little bit of an influence. But I was thinking, people from that background, certainly in this country, in England, are often drawn to certain hobbies, right? So the number one on the list was the heavy metal, right? So heavy metal is like that's like the equivalent of rap, I think, in England, or hip hop. It's kind of like, if you're from a poor background, but you've got some creativity, you'd go into heavy metal. So heavy metal was one. War games is another one. Making like military models, like plastic models, or role playing. So if you're kind of if you're from that kind of a background, but you're slightly creative, you're slightly sensitive, for want of a better word, you're slightly intellectual, you're slightly bookish, you don't really have the kind of traditional outlets that posh people would have, you know, because you're not going to school and reading ancient Greek or learning Latin or anything, right? So you don't really know about university or kind of intellectual pursuits in that way. You're kind of looking for something else, and you kind of fix on those hobbies that I was talking about, and they often have a kind of symbiotic relationship, right? Like obviously heavy metal, war games, role-playing games kind of have this slight, I don't know what you'd call it really, but there's an interplay between those different hobbies. So you kind of get drawn into that dynamic, you know. So that was a big part of it. And I think gaming stores were big, you know, because you used to go, what we used to do, you know, on a Saturday, we'd go to the local shopping center, and there was, you know, you'd go around the gaming shop, and there would be like Rifts, and you look at the Rifts covers, and it would just be like completely mind-blowing. It's like nothing you'd ever seen before, you know. So, and that was the same with heavy metal too, right? You'd see the record covers of like heavy metal bands, and it would be like, wow. So it's kind of, you got kind of drawn in from that reason. So that was, I guess, the intellectual superstructure, was that kind of, I don't know what you call it. Is it a subculture is the right word for it? I don't know, but whatever that is, whatever that phenomenon was, it was very much in the air in the 80s. You know, I don't know if it is there so much now, but yeah, it was really kind of, it was the zeitgeist in my kind of background in the 80s, definitely.
Yeah. I can perceive what you're talking about. I couldn't name it, but definitely.
Yeah, it's like everyone's older brother. Everyone had an older brother, it seemed, or at least one older brother, and that older brother was always into slightly edgy, you know, kind of, you know, if you're 10, you know, and you look at like the cover of Rifts, you know, the famous one, the Keith Parkinson cover, where you've got, I mean, I haven't played Rifts in ages, but it's got this like horrible monster on the front who's riding this kind of like sail barge thing, and he's got these naked slave girls on the front of it, and you know, when you're 10 and your friend's big brother has that, and you it's just like incredible. It's like, you know, this is like this is what I've been looking for my whole life, kind of thing. Yeah, it's whatever that is. It was that. Yeah.
Felt potential. So here's one. So you mentioned the war games and how that played. I was going to ask this question later, but this seems like the right time to do it. At some point along the line, you mentioned, maybe not today, but like in your writing, playing Warhammer almost every day. 14-year-old boy. I was like, heaven on earth. So what was that like?
Yeah, well, my best friend at the time had two brothers, and they were one of those families. I mean, this is a phenomenon that I guess kind of doesn't exist now, because kids don't play in the same way that they did. And I think maybe my generation were kind of the last generation who did this, but after school, you were basically free to do whatever you wanted, right? You could go wherever you wanted. Like nobody was keeping an eye on you. You know, my parents were both working, and that was the same for everybody. You used to walk home from school, you know, half an hour walk, and then you were just free at a loose end. So I used to go to my friend's house, where he had these two brothers, and all of the kids, all the boys in like the streets around, just used to congregate on his house. It was just like one of those families. They were very sociable, like three boys, you know, kind of like, so all their friends would always be there. And they had this big living room with a big snooker table. I don't know if snooker's like a snooker table is like 3 times the size of a pool table, right? So it's a huge table with this massive, I guess it must have been like MDF, just like a huge board of wood on top of it. And they had just loads and loads of Warhammer models and Warhammer 40k models. So yeah, we just used to play that. Like we used to play Warhammer. Sometimes we play 40k. Sometimes we play Necromunda, which I don't know if that exists anymore, but we loved that. That was a great game. Blood Bowl. The Blood Bowl was great as well. Yeah, we just played them obsessively. So if it wasn't playing D&D, which we did sometimes, then it was yeah, we mostly played Warhammer, to be honest. Yeah. And then you would go home and have dinner and then go back and play it again later on, you know. So yeah, but I mean, it's kind of, you know, looking back, it wasn't very sophisticated, because I think most of what we did was just like literally just trying to destroy each other's models. So that was every battle. I think I've written this about on the blog as well. It's like every battle is just a fight to the death, right? It's just like, can you destroy the other person's army? And there's no turn limit. It's just like the game ends when like the other side is completely destroyed. They don't have any troops left. That's the end.
Elemental. Yeah. I didn't lack for gaming opportunities when I was that age, but that sounds like Shangri-La. That's like that.
Yeah, it wasn't great for meeting girls. I think that's the only problem, because I went to like an all boys school. Like a lot of state schools in England are single sex. So it's just like boys' school, and then like go home and play Warhammer. So it wasn't really the greatest. If you wanted to, the dating scene wasn't so good. But yeah, it was. Yeah, it's fun. Halcyon days, as they say. Halcyon days. And we used to start for summer. We would do more outside kind of activities, but like, yeah, pretty much the rest of the time it was just constantly Warhammer. Yeah, constantly. And Warhammer is just part of that. I mean, we didn't mention that, but Warhammer is part of that thing too, right? That heavy metal role-playing games, war games, Warhammer. It's just totally in that space, or it was then. I think they're trying to break away from that now. Games Workshop are. Maybe they have successfully, but back then it was very much that kind of very male. Like it was very exclusionary. There's no getting away from that. It was very, very male. It was smelly. It was a load of guys with bad BO congregating around a table, rolling dice. Yeah, exactly. So yeah. Leather jackets, like Iron Maiden t-shirts, like playing Warhammer. Yeah.
Just doesn't seem too bad. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now, this, what? Actually, I'm going to reverse the order of these two questions. So first of all, just when you were a boy, so we just touched on this briefly. I know Lord of the Rings, and then you mentioned the fighting books and whatnot. Other literary or artistic, like foundational works that sort of inspired your inner landscape. Maybe later on, I'm not sure, or like a little bit when you were doing these battles. Maybe like books that your dad had or stuff like that. Stuff that foisted on you at school. Were like foundational works there, or was that something that came sort of later?
I think definitely Lord of the Rings, definitely The Hobbit. I read The Hobbit, and then I read the Two Towers first of the Lord of the Rings books. So I didn't really get what was going on at first, but it didn't really matter, because obviously you just get caught up in the story of the Two Towers. Definitely fighting fantasy. I think more than novels, it was fighting fantasy, and it was also Warhammer codexes. This idea of like getting a bestiary, or like a Space Marine codex, and just reading through it and discovering this kind of a world. So it's not really about a story particularly. It's more this idea that there's this other reality that feels completely its own thing. It's got no relationship to our reality, right? And that's the genius of Tolkien, right? Because I think he was the first person to really achieve that. Even though the original inspiration for Middle Earth was that it was some kind of myth from our reality, right? If you kind of read the Lord of the Rings books, there's no reference to our world at all. It's its own thing. And the same thing's true of Warhammer, right? When you're reading a Warhammer bestiary or something, there's no sort of suggestion that there's any relationship between their world and ours. It's its own thing. The same thing with the fighting fantasy books, right? It's its own reality. So I think rather than reading stories, it was more just that feeling of, wow, yeah, this is a complete separate kind of act of creation, right? That it doesn't bear any kind of, well, it does bear a resemblance to our world, but that you can't really escape that, can you? Because you can't really think of something that doesn't. But it doesn't have any kind of direct connection. So it's not like a fairy tale. It's not like a myth. It's more of an act of, I guess Tolkien called it subcreation, right? You're creating your own kind of world. It's a mirror image of what God was doing when he created this world. So yeah, I think it was reading that kind of paraphernalia. But also I think the local library, because I think, again, this is something that's changed a lot, but we used to go to the library a lot, kids, growing up in the 80s and the early 90s. The library was very important. You would go there and you would be opened up to all kinds of experiences that you wouldn't have normally. At least literature is very wise. So I was reading Lone Wolf books, Lone Wolf novels. The Lone Wolf novels were really good. I was really into those. A lot of the kind of there were a lot of sort of books for adolescents, and I guess there still are now, that were really influential that I don't think people really remember so well now. There was a book, for example, called Nicobobinus that I read that was written by Terry Jones, who was in the Monty Python. But he wrote one called Nicobobinus, and he wrote something called Eric the Viking, and they were kind of illustrated books, really beautiful illustrations. I remember them, kind of really obsessing me as a kid. I think possibly also the Bible, because I was brought up in going to church and going to Sunday school every week, and I think the Bible's underrated, isn't it? It really is an imaginative sort of source. There's so much in there that can spur the imagination. If you're reading, especially the Old Testament, you think hitting all these tribes, warring with one another, killing each other, all these kind of monsters who appear in the kind of symbology of the Bible. So I think that probably did bleed into things as well. And films, you can't really escape films either. Star Wars. I think I've really grown off Star Wars. I blame George Lucas for that, for making the prequels, but I think now I don't know. I don't like the way Star Wars has gone since Disney took it over. I just think like rehashing the originals, just why are you doing that? They could have taken it in so many interesting directions and they didn't. So I've gone off Star Wars, but I did obsess over it as a little kid. I watched like Empire Strikes Back, like God knows how many times I've seen that film, because it was. I don't know if it's the same way you grew up, but it was always on at Christmas time when I was a kid. They would show the three films over the course of Christmas, and so I'd record them on VHS, and I just watched them like all the time, just until you'd memorize the script, like indelibly into your mind. So I'm sure Star Wars had a huge influence. Yeah, it must have done. And you've got to thank George Lucas. I think George Lucas, whatever you can say about the prequels, I do think he had such a big influence on kids, growing up in the 80s, right? 70s, 80s, and 90s. He's such a huge figure in kind of creating the kind of geek culture that's, I guess, kind of emerged from that era. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other things. Things that people don't normally mention. I used to read a lot of boys' adventure books as well, like the Hardy Boys, that kind of thing. And I'm sure that also figures in there as well, because I think those sorts of books have influenced or did influence Gary Gygax as well, and possibly and that kind of the early D&D creators, because I think a lot of those books, I mean, the Hardy Boys, there were just two brothers, were there? I can't remember now. It's so long since I've read them.
Yeah, I grew up. I don't remember exactly how many myself.
Yeah, but a lot of those books, and in Britain as well, as I don't know if you heard of the Famous Five, but there's the Famous Five and the Secret Seven. There's always this kind of gang, isn't there? Kind of roughly 5 people who solve problems, or exactly. They solve crimes. They do something anyway, and that really. No one really talks about that, but that has a huge influence on D&D. I think this idea that you've got this gang of kind of 5 people who are friends, and they kind of go on missions and quests and things. So yeah, I'm sure that kind of like that influenced my thinking later on and made maybe kind of D&D seem more palatable. This concept of a gang of people kind of going out and doing amazing things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. The superstructure part of the place.
Yeah.
The Bible, the Old Testament, I've drawn on that directly. I mean, and especially as a way of getting into a mindset, like a human mindset that's within the human, spirit, but completely different from.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Also, you're talking about world building as a way of transporting somebody to another world. That's something that reoccurred. That's something that occurred to me when I was rereading Yoon-Suin. Was one of the best, or one of the most precious gifts that an artist can give to the recipient of their work is to viscerally transport them into another place. And sensory depictions, sensory descriptions are a really good way of doing that. Of course, you can also focus on the more mythical stuff, or focus on the more mythical subject matter that strikes right at the core of the reader. Gives them a sense of heightened reality. Okay,
Yeah.
so now this is well, the order doesn't really matter. Anyways, so we talked a little bit about well, for one, where you grew up, at least the baseline of it. But then I know you did some traveling. You spent some countries, and so how did that come about? And what was the ultimate effect of that? Or what were the experiences that you had when you were doing that, and how did it inform your later development as a writer?
Well, that's good. There's a lot in that. I think I was always I think, well, let's kind of like, if we take a step back for a second and I kind of lead on to that, to answering that question. So I was playing D&D a lot when I was a teenager, and then I kind of stopped, as you do. I kind of grew out of it when I was about 15 or 16, say, something like that. I went away to university, kind of forgot about it more or less. I still knew it was there in existence, but I didn't really ever have any interest in playing it anymore. Went to live in Japan when I was 21. And I was in Japan for a couple of years when I think I got a hankering to play RPGs again. And I started playing an email game, play by email. A couple of them actually, with people all around the world, because I think at that time the main way people used to play online was Yahoo groups. So you'd have a Yahoo group and you would email the main listserv kind of thing, and it would email everybody else. And so I kind of got re-interested in it, if that's the right word, then. And so a lot of my interaction, well, all of my play, for want of a better word, then was in the written form, right? So there was just a direct reason to write things, because like all I was doing was writing it. I wasn't actually, I don't think the technology really existed then to do it online in a video kind of a way. So it was just kind of natural to be writing stuff. So I think that kind of like maybe set me on the course of writing things again, because obviously when I was a teenager, I'd kind of had it in mind that I wanted to write books, but I never really was able to do that. But I think maybe the practice of writing emails for these email games kind of got me into the swing of writing. And I think I was working really hard. And I was working for a startup, and we used to work. I used to work 6 days a week, and it was usually about 12 hours a day. And so didn't have a lot of time for socializing, really. Didn't have a lot of time for blazing around, didn't really have a lot of time for other hobbies. But I did have a lot of time to just sit there at the computer and just like write stuff. I could write an email to myself with ideas. And I think, so I was kind of in this just a confluence of circumstances which were just encouraging me to do a lot of writing. And then I think as a result of that, I got into this idea of blogging. And I think I wish I could remember why it was that this happened, but I obviously got it into my head that original Dungeons and Dragons was a thing and people were still playing it. And there was this thing called the old school Renaissance or the old school revival or whatever. I'm not even really sure if that's what it was being called then, but this would have been kind of early or late 2007, early 2008. I really can't remember why it was that I started getting interested in that, but I just did, and that was the reason why I started writing a blog, I suppose, in 2008.
Might have been third edition. Sorry, go on.
Say again.
Oh, I was going to say it might have been third edition, making people.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think that is what started the OSR off. I think definitely, or fourth edition. Sorry, no, it was fourth edition. The release of fourth edition, because that really annoyed people the way they were changing the game. I think that really put like rocket fuel on the whole OSR phenomenon, I guess. But yeah, so I think more than living in Japan influencing things because of being surrounded by a different culture or whatever, I think it was more just the particular circumstances set me in that direction. But having said that, I've always been interested in going to other countries and traveling. So I've traveled to lots of different places, and right from the age of going to university, I was always in my head that after I graduated, I was going to go and live somewhere else.
Right.
So I went around, I like did volunteering in Central Asia for one summer. I worked in France for a summer. I had it in mind to go to Greece because I had a Greek girlfriend at the time, but that fell through. So I was kind of like a bit of a loose end, kind of as I was graduating from university. So I just thought, well, I'll go to Japan. And so I went there, and I think just like what you were talking about the Old Testament, I think that the experience of living in a really totally different culture definitely opens your mind up to the idea that there are just different ways of seeing reality, even though human beings, there is a kind of fundamental human nature. I'm not one of these people who thinks it's all subjective or it's all socially constructed. It's not. That's nonsense. There is a human nature, but culture can radically alter how that human nature manifests itself, right? And being in Japan is very, very different because of its very distinctive history, its very distinctive culture. The fact that there's a guy called Basil Chamberlain, who was an early anthropologist in Japan, when Japan just started opening up at the end of the 19th century. And one of his famous observations was that if you want to understand the difference between Japan and Europe, you have to remember that the Japanese were never Christians. And what he meant by that is that, you've got this huge weight of culture behind European civilization that comes from Christianity that doesn't exist in Asia, right? So they have completely different foundational texts, foundational philosophies, right? And that bleeds through into how they live their lives now. And that always struck me as being so fundamentally true. There's just these huge differences that, go back thousands of years in their roots. But yeah, at the same time, we are still human beings. We can still relate to each other at that level. So yeah, this idea that, you can have human beings in completely radically different contexts, having radically different views, radically different experiences, that definitely kind of filtered through into thinking about fantasy worlds. Yeah, for sure. Because you're no longer thinking about, well, here's a bunch of medieval peasants, but they just happen to be orcs, right? You're thinking about things in a much more different sort of a way. And you also, I suppose, thinking about your own culture's past in a different way too, because obviously medieval peasants perceive the world in a totally different way to how we perceive it as well, right? They, for them, nothing was explainable by reason, right? There wasn't really such a thing as human reason. It was explained by myth, it was explained by superstitions. So yeah, I think there's no way that you can avoid thinking about things more deeply, I guess, if you live in a different country for a long time. And if you learn another language, learning another language makes you realize that there are different ways of thinking about even just everyday objects. The best example, the best illustration of that is that in Japanese, the word for grass, if you see freshly cut grass on a lawn, you'd say it's green. But in Japan, they say it's blue. That even at the level of color, right? The words are different. So yeah, that kind of opens your eyes to the fact that perspectives can be different, right? Yeah, very different.
Yeah, I remember reading a study or something at some point about, I think it was about the way that people from different cultures perceive layered prisms and what they notice about it, either focusing on a part of it or the whole. And I remember being struck by there was a big difference. They mentioned the Japanese and some Western societies. I don't remember which ones, but yeah, really just down to the level of perception, things can be. Right. Did you have any particular? This is just a little ditty I'm curious about. Did you have any experiences or seeing vistas or in Central Asia or Japan that have either worked their way into your work or were like a fundamental shifting point?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, well, it is a cliche, but when you walk around the downtown sort of district of Tokyo is not really one city with one downtown, right? It's like 25 different downtowns. They're all kind of different because it's like a conglomeration of cities. But when you're walking around Shinjuku or Shibuya and you're looking at everything's just piled on top of itself. Everything's in your face. Everything's all these different colors. Every building is really high and it's full of different shops, restaurants, cafes, offices. It's so densely populated with stuff as well as with people, right? And I think when you're there, it feels like a drug. It's like an adrenaline rush just to see it all. And I think that certainly I love that kind of vista, it's there in Blade Runner too, isn't it? But Blade Runner doesn't really capture what it's like to be in an Asian city, like a really densely populated Asian city, because Hong Kong's like that as well, right? Even more so. And I love that kind of scene. So I think that definitely fed into like the Yellow City, that kind of thinking about Asian cities. But I think Central Asia, in terms of like the physicality of Central Asia, I think that's definitely because that's the first place I went, which was really, really different to home. Well, no, that's not true, because I went backpacking around Israel when I was a teenager as well, and I think that probably did also had a similar effect, because the geography is very different. Central Asia, particularly, it's dry. The mountains, everything's just bigger than Britain. Britain's very small. The geography of Britain is very, very small and very kind of folding in. Whereas Central Asia, it's big and it's kind of like out there. Everything's vast. I mean, like the American West must be like, just feels like you're in an open space. So more than maybe, I don't think anything I've written is like kind of copying that, but I think just that feeling of being somewhere very different to what you're used to impacted me. I think Israel, the sense you get when you're traveling around Israel is how old the world is and how many different cultures that there are and different groups that there are in the world, right? You think if you haven't been to Israel and if you don't really know much about it, you think of it as just being, right, okay, there's Jews and there's Palestinians and they hate each other and they're always fighting. But it's not really like that, right? Because each group is so multi-layered, and there are Arab Christians and there are Druzes and there are Christian, other kind of Jewish sects. There are different Christian sects. You walk around Jerusalem and it just feels like it is an ancient city, but it feels like that, right? It just feels very, very old. Like it's been around for a long time. And there are all these different layers of people who've lived there and they've kind of like all left their mark. So that feeling that the world is old, it's lived in, there's a lot to it. There's way more in it than you think, and you could ever really catalog, So yeah, I think that feeling too. Yeah, that definitely is in there. Yeah.
Right. All right. Cool. Exactly what I was hoping to hear about is okay. So, well, we can get into some of your. I mean, I always want to say professional work, but it's what I guess I mean is your creative and literary work. Mm-hmm. That's not sure. That's not. Okay, so so when you were writing and conceptualizing Yoon-Suin in the first place, mm-hmm. I want to ask you about to what degree it was like a product of just sort of bathing in your own imagination and mm-hmm. letting it you, or mm-hmm. was it something that came out in a flash, like an inspiration? Like a sudden realization, or was it more like directed dreaming? Like what was your process for bringing it forth, or
yeah,
process?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I think directed dreaming is a good way of putting it. Actually, most of the basic idea of it I came up with when I was living in Japan. It must have been about 2009 or 2010, and I was actually running an email game then, which was set in what became the mountains of the moon in that bit of the setting. So I was kind of, so that was the original kind of idea, but then a lot of the developments of it came years later. That would have been about 2012, 2013, when I just moved back to the UK, and I had my first like proper job back in the UK. And I was just moved to the northeast of England. So I was living in Gateshead at the time, which is just like kind of the northeast of England, near Newcastle. And my wife was living in a different place, and I was commuting. So I'd spend the week up here and then the weekends down, back with her. And so what I would do most nights, I was kind of by myself, didn't really know anybody because I just moved to a new city. And so I'd often just sit there with the football on in the background. So I'd have the TV on and a notepad in front of me, and I would just be jotting down ideas as they came to me, just like riffing, if you like. And I'd say like 90% of what's in Yoon-Suin probably came from that, just that notepad, what I'd kind of jotted down. At least at the level of the content of the world, if you see what I mean. And then after that, it was just a question of translating all of that into tables. So I kind of had it in my head that I wanted to do a setting made out of random tables, because I don't like really getting a book and then just reading it and it just tells you what's. I've never really enjoyed that. Like you used to read like the old Al-Qadim or Planescape books, and it would just be, oh, well, here's this town and it's got these NPCs in it. And I would never have run that the way it was, and I could never imagine anyone doing that, so I never wanted to do that. So I thought, well, what's a better way of doing a campaign setting? Well, it's giving someone just kind of like the inspiration for creating their own version of the thing, which is what they're going to do anyway, right? So you may as well just kind of like facilitate that. So I had it in my head that I wanted to do these tables. So I would note down some ideas for what the tables were going to be without filling them in. It's just kind of like, okay, I'll have a table for tea shops or whatever, And so I had this big book of ideas, and then it was just a question of the next couple of years, just sitting down and working out what was in the tables. So it's kind of this long period of what you call directed dreaming, I guess, of coming up with the ideas and noting them down, and then a period of just sort of sitting at a table and writing or typing it into a computer, And I think, this all came about after I'd done a PhD, and I think doing a PhD definitely helped, because you just have to get into the discipline of writing every day. And I think once you're writing every day, you just get this momentum, and it becomes hard to stop doing it. And once you're in that zone, you just have to keep kind of following it through. And that's kind of worked for everything else that I've done as well. Because I have other things that have just as long that are kind of waiting in the background that I've finished writing, and other things that I'm working on at the moment. And now that I've got that momentum, I find it really hard to imagine not writing every day, at least a little bit. So I get up early in the morning and do it now. But back then I was doing it at night, it was mostly in the evening. So I'd get home from work, and then it would be, okay, I've got to write for an hour, and I would just do that. Yeah. So like a long period of directed dreaming, as you put it, and then a condensed period of like just, donkey work of just writing it.
Yeah. How early do you get up to write nowadays?
About 5 o'clock. Sometimes I get up a bit later, but yeah, it helps having a family, because once you have little kids, like all of your time kind of like moves forward. Do you know what I mean? Like I used to stay up until midnight, whereas now I go to bed about 10 o'clock. So everything's kind of shifted 2 hours earlier. So I used to get up at 7:30, and now I get up at like 5:30 or 5 o'clock. And it's a really nice time, actually, because it's really quiet. There's no real temptation to go online. There's no temptation to watch TV. You can just sit there and just, you can have an hour and a half of just pure time for yourself, time to think about things. Yeah. And in winter, it's great, because it's dark, so it's kind of, you're in this slightly dreamy space still. So I think it kind of facilitates things somehow.
Yeah, completely. And I don't get up and write that early. Sometimes I want to. I have read that there is some sort of like physiological effect that writers have tapped into for a long time by either staying up all night until they get to that time, or getting up really early and hitting it at that time.
Yeah. I think that's true. I actually heard this really, really interesting podcast interview And if I remember who it was with, I'll send you a link to it, and you can put a link to it on the video or whatever. But there's this guy, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he'd spent most of his career as an academic studying the brain's cycles throughout the day. And he's one of the few people who had thought about that and its impact on creativity. You know, you get these kind of, the brain is active at different times and it thinks in a different way at different times during the course of the day. And he kind of identifies the creative time as being the point where you're kind of just about to go into dreams. You know, you're very sleepy and you're just about to, you know, you're in very light sleep or just on the verge of light sleep. And that's the point at which you get the most ideas. But the problem is that you're just about to fall asleep. So the trick that creative people throughout history have tried to master is getting into that zone, but still being awake enough to write down the ideas. And I think, yeah, there's something about being early in the morning. Maybe you're still in that kind of dream world a tiny bit, you know, and it's still there somewhere in the background. We've got this idea that we're either awake or asleep. But I think his point is that it's actually more of like a continuum or process, right? And I had sleep problems about 4 years ago, and so I read quite a bit about sleep. And I read there's a guy who he's got this insomnia cure that really works, like a kind of like involving like meditation and things. It worked for me anyway, really well. But he's an expert in sleep too, like scientific expert, and he made the convincing case to me that whether you're very awake, you've got very awake states, and you've got deep sleep, but the rest of your life is between those two kind of spheres, right? And it's not a question of a clicking a switch and it's like you're asleep. There's this transition. When you wake up in the morning, you don't realize that you went through this quite long transition from wakefulness to sleep, but actually you do, and it takes quite a long time. You know, it's not just an immediate thing. So yeah, if you can kind of, maybe when you wake up at 5 o'clock, you're 90% awake, but there's still a part of your brain that's in the dream zone. Yeah, and it's kind of, yeah, it's and I think also you're really energetic because you're just woken up. You know, that's when you're most, everything's kind of like more vivid to you. You know, after you've gone through like the dreary phase of like getting out of bed, you know, you have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and then you're like wide awake and you're not tired because you know you've just had a sleep. Right. So you've got plenty of energy to just write things.
Yeah, you get a cortisol jolt to wake you up, and then just off that too. So you're probably driven to take care of that and get after it. Recently I've been tending to do idea generation right before bed. You know, when the sun's down, just like lay on let my drift. Good things that come out of that. I'm watching a series by a Stanford neurobiology professor about, you know, like sort of these matters, and he was the continuum that you were talking about. I'm not sure if this is the same thing, but it made me remember this is the idea of autonomic arousal, being that it's when you're like dead asleep, and then hypermanic, it's super, super high. And then there's the continuum in the middle of it, like a high level of autonomic arousal. It was his characterization of it, a high level of autonomic arousal. You know, when you're amped up, you're super focused, you know, caffeinated, all of that. It's great for knocking out directed tasks. And the low level of it, when you're like, you know, like on the verge of sleep, is really good for the generation of ideas. So
it might be the same guy, because I think the guy I was thinking of is a professor at Stanford as well. So it might be the same person. Yeah. Say again.
Andrew Huberman, I think his
might
name
be. Yeah, I'd have to. That name doesn't ring a bell, but yeah, maybe it's someone who works with him or something. Yeah, but yeah, for sure. I think there's. Do you know Noel Gallagher, who's in Oasis? He, I'm not a fan of Oasis at all, but I heard an interview with him where he talked about TV, and it's true actually that watching TV can actually be really helpful in the phase of coming up with ideas. Because he said what he does when he's writing songs is he has the TV on in the background of quite a low level volume, but not completely silent. So just there in the background, and he's playing his guitar and he's just kind of noodling around. And there's something about being slightly distracted by the TV. So it's like your conscious mind is slightly distracted by the TV, and another part of your brain, another kind of module, is coming up with creative ideas. And it's almost like your conscious mind stops monitoring what the creative bit's doing, and that kind of frees it up to come up with ideas. So, and I think that there is something to that actually, because having the football on in the background helps me to come up with ideas. Not necessarily football, but that's the thing I would normally watch. It's just the kind of like slightly, it doesn't take all of your conscious, it takes a bit of your conscious mind, but not the whole of your mind, right? And there's something about that zone that works for creativity. Yeah, but then of course, when it comes to actually writing things, you can't have the TV on because, when it's serious, I mean, because that just is too much of a distraction. When you actually have to write something, you need to be focused. You need complete freedom from distraction, or I do anyway. No music, nothing, just you silently. Nothing to stop you, nothing to make your mind wander. You have to be on it. But the idea process, the idea creating phase, it can be good to have distractions.
Yeah, completely. Like to get a really busy cafes and stuff like that for that.
Yeah, exactly.
If I can focus on something, I can't do that.
Yeah,
Okay, so in Yoon-Suin, you range around pretty widely inside of its space, but it's tonally consistent. And so, it doesn't bounce around a lot in terms of tone. It's like a deep, and so when you would conceptualize and generate a certain part of it, were you considering the whole, or were you mostly just focused on individual hexes, as it were, or like discrete sections of the land? Because not all of it is like connected in a daily way. There's the atolls with the crabmen, mainland, but
yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't think I was consciously striving to create the same tone. I think that might just be an accident of the fact that, well, I was going to say it might just be an accident of the fact that I happen to be the person who was writing it, but then I don't think I think looking back, I think I was definitely aware that I wanted to create a particular feeling of I guess a kind of tonal palette that was going to be the same from area to area. And I think if I wanted to say what's on that tonal palette, I think it's kind of uncaring or kind of like a slightly Lovecraftian. I mean, Lovecraftian in the kind of philosophical sense that the universe doesn't care about people particularly, right? Individual people or people's, in general, right? What happens to individual people is not of consequence in the grand scheme of things. So I think I wanted to create that feeling throughout. At the same time, I wanted to create the feeling that people in Yoon-Suin care about aesthetics, like wherever they are, aesthetics kind of has a meaning or an importance to it. That it might not be the same aesthetic, but there is a sense of aesthetics that's important, a sense that learning is important, a sense that certain foodstuffs or certain drinks are important as well. I think I wanted to have those themes kind of in every different region. So I don't think I ever thought consciously, when I'm writing such and such a bit of, describing some region, I don't think I was ever thinking, right, well, this has to look like one of the other regions in this respect, or that there has to be direct correlations or connections between them. But I think I was just aware in my own mind that I wanted to create a certain mood that was informed by certain themes. And well, it sounds, I mean, I do think it works, if I don't want to sort of blow my trumpet too much, but I do think it has that feeling of being, every region's different, but there are the same themes in all of them, right? So it seems that I hope that
yeah,
I do think it does do that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the reason I brought it up.
Yeah.
like the Lovecraftian sense of cosmic indifference. That's something that's really effective about it, and something that is something that's good to do for people who can do it. I guess it's I don't want to say it's unheard of, but because it's not, but it's something effective that I think maybe either isn't done enough, or is like a possibility space that has yet to be broadly explored at the level of culture. There's because in Yoon-Suin, it's different than, say, a lot of Cormac McCarthy's work, because in Cormac McCarthy's work, there's a sort of cosmic indifference to the good or evil that affects people's lives, but it's cloaked in something, in this what's the word, foreboding, or it's like slightly tinged towards the negative.
Right.
When you read the historical record, you do see all of this cruelty. You see all of these like social hierarchies that cannot be reached in a day. You know what I'm talking about? Really stacked up in a way that we can barely imagine. And so, but you read that people are still, living out their lives in the midst of it. And I think that you captured that with Yoon-Suin, where there is a cosmic indifference to people's lives, but it's not like the world is dangerous, but it's not inherently malevolent.
Right. Exactly.
In some works, and that's things that's so remarkable about it, because it just reflect. If you go in and read the histories of the world, it does reflect a way that's rare in role-playing games, and just rare in general, but effective. So
right. No, I'm glad you made those observations, because that's definitely what I felt. I think, well, I mean, I would Cormac McCarthy is a big influence, because Blood Meridian, I must have read Blood Meridian round about the time shortly before I was writing Yoon-Suin, and there's no doubt that did influence it hugely, because it's just a great book. It's just an amazing book. But like you say, tinged towards the negative, and it's the same with Lovecraft, right? That Lovecraft, it's not cosmic indifference, it's cosmic malice, really, isn't it? The world, it doesn't care about you, except to the extent that it wants to cause you pain and suffering. it's kind of and I think a huge amount of it's the same thing, actually, that we go back to Orson Scott Card and his Tolkien observation. People look at Lovecraft, and a lot of people ape Lovecraft, and they made the mistake of thinking that that's about copying this idea that there are these gods in the universe who are evil, or don't care about human beings, but it's not that. It's just that the idea that you can have a universe that exists purely in its own right, that doesn't really have any sort of connection to our own, and that is based on a kind of an understanding of history as being a bunch of things that happen, and that will happen whether or not they affect any particular individual in a particular way, right? Like, history has its own course, and it's not going to be affected by any feeling of compassion towards any particular person, or any feeling of vengeance, or malice towards any particular person. It just happens, right? So I do think you absolutely hit the nail on the head when you said that there is this tendency to kind of take that Lovecraftian, slightly jaundiced view of cosmic indifference, when all cosmic indifference really means is, the cosmos is indifferent. It's not biased one way or the other, right? It just, stuff happens, and that's the story of human history, right? It's just a bunch of things that happened, and no individual person can really do anything about that. But that's not to say that there's anything particularly negative or positive about it. It's just the way that the world is,
got some gravitas for some reason.
I don't know. I think maybe there's something kind of negativity, or well, no, not negativity is the wrong word. Darkness has its gravitas, right? Certainly, and it definitely does in OSR kind of circles. There is a tendency to want to make everything bleak and grim all the time, and I think I've got a slightly more optimistic kind of personality, I guess, in the sense that I don't, I quite like I like horror, and I like the kind of grim, bleak aspects of life, but at the same time, that's not all that there is, right? And I guess that's another thing that I wanted to bring across in Yoon-Suin, is that suffering is not all that there is, right? There is suffering, there is slavery, there's war, there's famine, there are all these kinds of awful things that happen, but there's also beautiful things that are created, and that's human history too, right? Plague in Europe also happens to produce wonderful works of art, wonderful works of philosophy. When Bach was writing most of his orchestral work, plague was sweeping Europe. It's just, you've got both. There's never one or the other. You've always got kind of beauty alongside misery, I think, most of the time anyway. So yeah, I hope that sort of comes across too. There's the kind of, I think what geeks are really bad at, and what RPG geeks are really bad at in particular, is thinking about art in a serious way. I think Patrick Stewart's made this point quite a lot, that in Warhammer 40k, the only time art ever gets referenced, or music, is when they're referencing things from our era or earlier, right? Like they'll during the Horus Heresy, they'll discover like, oh, here's a vinyl recording of like the Beatles or something, or here's I don't know, here's a book written by Charles Dickens or something, as though like the next 40,000 years of human history have like produced nothing. There's like no art to come from it. And I've always thought, yeah, that's the same in Tolkien too. Like they don't really produce art, do they? Like they do a bit of poetry and a bit of singing, but they don't ever produce their own art in the world. And so I've always kind of rebelled up against that. Like, why in Yoon-Suin, why wouldn't people be creating art for themselves of their own? Why wouldn't they be making music? Why wouldn't they be doing the things that human beings do? The same thing in D&D, right? In the Forgotten Realms, why wouldn't they be just as artistically creative as human beings always are? Yeah, seems something strange about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel you on every single one of those points. It's like the world can be dangerous while still being beautiful. Those things aren't really exclusive. And just like you, I appreciate the aesthetics of ruin, like sort of substratum. But I don't necessarily do stuff in that vein. It's like there are plenty of wondrous poisonous animals. There are plenty of knights who are, like just absolute killers, but their library is, absolutely incredible. Warhammer 40K, is steeped in that, like beauteous killers, in every way, at least in the Imperium, the Eldar and whatnot. Yeah, completely. I have a friend, Dan Sullivan. He asked me, about Morkborg, which I think is, it was a treat to read, but like, and I want them to keep doing it and keep producing their line. But it's like, it's just not my central orientation, because it's like, why not have both? Why not have all the adventure, the clashing, and darkness along the way, and there is ruin there, but then there's this glorious corpus, this like silver substream of like the human imagination that like shines throughout history, in the form of high art. It's funny, it's like even in the midst of that, it's like a beautiful weapon, a knight in beautiful armor, it's like deadliness and art, and like the human will, all of that stuff is not, like not mutually exclusive. It's like people want to sanitize art, but they take so much of its they take the fuel out of it so much of the time when they do that. And because really deep art speaks to, like the deep things in the human spirit, and you can like control or corral those things to some degree, but they'll never be perfectly civilized. But it occurred to me, rereading Yoon-Suin, it's like what people popularly call Orientalism has some of the most beautiful fine art ever produced. It's like beautiful, great art doesn't come from a universe that's Manichaean. It doesn't originate in a universe where there's a clear line between, or at least a clear continuum between good and evil. It comes from something much more complicated, and the way it steeps you in meaning is reflects the nuanced, swirling, environment of right and wrong. Trying to those things to the degree that they exist is well, it comes from that environment. It doesn't, kitsch and propaganda come from a Manichaean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's and Milan Kundera's, I don't know if you read The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but like his kind of dissection of communist art is exactly about that, right? That the ideologue wants art to conform with like a conception of the good, right? Or a kind of there needs to be an agreement between art and an ideological purpose, if you see what I mean. So the art has to be connected to a kind of idealized vision of reality. But that is just a recipe for absolutely terrible art. It's just a recipe for kitschy art, right? But the same thing is true the other direction as well. Like, he doesn't talk about that, but you can see that in something like Mork Borg. It's I don't want to bash it because, like, I haven't actually read it, but people have said really good things about the system and everything. But it just seems to be the other direction. It's kind of just if you want art to do the opposite and just be the kind of about everything being terrible, everything being bad, everything being dark. It's just the other end of the spectrum from kitsch, right? It's its own form of kitsch, really. Art is somewhere in the middle, as you point out. I can't really add anything to that. I think you're absolutely right.
It seems like the most enduring grimdark work is leavened with beauty. That's the point. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, I think I'll come back to that one. So how do you GM or DM? What's your process for conceptualization of a game, preparation, and what's your process for what you, if there is one, for what you do during the game?
Well, I do a lot of planning. I try to front load the planning. So I try to get everything kind of like worked out, or mostly anyway, beforehand. So like, say if you're running like a mega dungeon, I would try and get everything mapped, like the first couple of levels at least, like fully mapped out and keys and everything, and get the surrounding area kind of thought out beforehand. Because then I find, like, once you're in the game and things start getting created, you can kind of draw from that to fill out more, but everything kind of gets a momentum of its own after a while. So what happens in a session will give you the impetus to make something else or create some other elements of things. So I kind of try to have a big kind of field of possibilities already mapped out in my own, or on paper, and also in my own mind. And then that kind of provides the core of the whole campaign, because once the players sort of get into it, they start doing things, and that starts to have a knock-on effect on other things. And then you can kind of like use that to create other stuff. Do you see what I mean? To kind of, doing a lot of initial prep, so that then what happens between each session is mostly kind of ticking over. You're just spending half an hour from session to session thinking, right, okay, the PCs did this in the previous session, so in the next session they're going to be doing this. So I need to have an idea of where things are going to go for the next time, and I'll draw from what I've already done to kind of inform that, right? So I think that's kind of like the nuts and bolts of it. I think I always try the games I run are really deadly. I think it's just the way it is. I find it more interesting that way. The game that I run a weekly game. I've been running it for about, it's probably 8 months, 9 months, pretty much every week. And all of the players have lost like 4 or 5 characters so far. And most weeks somebody dies. If it's not one of the PCs, then it'll be one of their like favorite hirelings or something. So I think I'm not really interested in a player in a PC having this long-lasting, like, deep relationship where the players sort of identify with their PC. I'm much more interested in the campaign being like a narrative that unfolds, not pre-planned, just it unfolds as you're playing. and different characters come and go. It's like an ensemble cast. It's more like a TV series in that way, like ER or something, right? Where, you have certain main characters who are there for a few series and then they go away and someone else comes along, like a soap opera, in that sense. Yeah, so lots and lots of death, lots of laughing, lots of kind of ironic. Because I think, again, cosmic indifference manifests itself in the way games are run as well, doesn't it? Because I think as the DM, you have to be cosmically indifferent. Like, you shouldn't be trying to either reward or punish the players or the PCs, right? It should just be what happens, happens. And I think if the players are on board with that as well, then it can make it really fun, because you're not particularly, you're not upset greatly when somebody dies. It can be bad, but you're more interested in what happens next. Okay, your PC has died, so who's the next person who's going to come along? Let's create that person. Let's see how they fit in. Let's see what happens to them. So it's more like, it's more like you're seeing what happens. Like, the fun of it is seeing what happens rather than investing in the events. So it's a slightly different level of abstraction, I guess. But it's like, I think a lot RPG players are often the same. I think in as much as they get really excited about combat, they get really excited about getting treasure and experience. They get excited by certain moments of like high drama, but also they tend to forget like almost everything else. So like from session to session, it's like remembering what happened last week is like quite hard, and remembering what happened like weeks and weeks ago is really, really difficult. So it's there's this funny, like, I think people still, like, you sort of inhabit again the sphere of adolescent boys, where it's kind of like or adolescents in general, I suppose you should say, really, where it's just there's a fight on, okay, so now we'll get really invested in it, we'll roll the dice really keenly, we're really interested in what's happening. But then after the fight's over, it's kind of like, we'll make a cup of tea, someone it's just kind of everything kind of like loses momentum. So and I think that's true of like everybody, or every game group I've been in has been like that. What people are most interested in is the dangerous elements, or thinking through a puzzle, or arranging what happens with the treasure, like who gets what, those sorts of things are when people are actually keenly engaged. Or like figuring out tactics, like they want to defeat a particular enemy and they want to set a trap. They get really excited about that. It's a half an hour of like plotting out the plan. There's something slightly childish, in a good way, like a slightly childish element to gaming sessions, I think, in that way. That's what people really want to do. They don't really want to do the acting. They don't really want to do the kind of emotions, much as some people might pretend that they do. I don't think they really do. I think the thing that really excites them is like, is my character going to kill this orc or whatever, in this round? Am I going to get a critical hit in this round, when I roll the D20? That's what people really want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hey, I mean, all combat, the getting treasure, and the moments of high drama, maybe those are some of those human universals that we alluded to when we were talking about hierarchy, coming from a messy place and so on.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt.
There's one thing that I've noticed that I'd add on top of that, which is players, okay, so they love all those things, and then there's one other thing for like, if they do tend to survive in a campaign, they like to develop organizations around their character. They don't like to receive like orders from somebody else. They don't like to defend pre-existing organization, but if they can create one from whole cloth, their own ideas around themselves, whether it's a cult that worships them or or productive enterprise, they love that. But
they do. True.
Like, I don't mean to, but a lot of players die in my campaigns too, and so it doesn't always get there. But if it does become longer, either because of the system or something like that, I just want to note that's something that they also tend to really, really like in my experience, no matter who they are. And that's really rare. The one that like all they want to do is like role play character. I think it exists, but I've maybe met one or two players like that.
Yeah. And it might be self-selecting in that those people don't play D&D in the end, but I think I do think they are rare to begin with. But it's funny that you mentioned that about organizations. You're absolutely right. It's whether it's like a pub, like they often like making their own inn, like like tavern or something, Or a cult, yeah. Like the game that I'm running at the moment, the campaign revolves around. It just ended up revolving around this cult of a particular Etruscan god, and the cult is itself more like a character now. Really, it's like, these individual people come and go and die off and get replaced by new people. It's more like the cult has its own kind of momentum. Yeah, yeah. The campaign is about the cult really, rather than the people. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's maybe that's a human universal as well. I don't know, like this need to sort of like create groups of and kind of create, I don't know, like a gang again, like that feeling of being part of a gang. I don't know, maybe. But I think it also happens in war games too. When war gamers role play, it's often because they're thinking about like a continuous. One thing I've noticed about wargamers is that if they're playing a continuous campaign, particularly, they'll get quite emotionally invested in particular units or particular, there'll be this regiment, who you've got, and some of the members will be killed off and get replaced or whatever. But you kind of start to identify with an army as being a kind of character in its own right. You see that a lot with Warhammer players as well. They kind of like creating their own Space Marine chapter, and it's like the chapter itself has this kind of personality, right? It's like an entity in its own right that you identify with. You're not really identifying with the models. It's the thing itself. Yeah, yeah.
I sometimes play advanced squad leader with this guy. He's this old guy, Sergeant Major in the 82nd Airborne Division, paratrooper. He always plays. I mean, when he can, he always plays American Airborne units, of course. And so,
yeah, right.
He's like this old salty guy, but when he's moving the pieces around, he's like, "All right, you motherfuckers."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Don't be there again.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. It's so easy to see how role-playing games came from war games, right? Because war gamers do role play, even when it's online. I used to play. Do you know Steel Panthers? Did you ever play that game?
I know.
It's like a hex sort of war game, or not, a digital hex war game thing, and really realistic. And these guys kind of got the code for it and just made it even more realistic. And they called it Steel Panthers World at War. And they're still working on it, I think, with new modifications and stuff. But they, real deep dives into, the different troop types and different tanks and their different specifications and stuff. And they used to play by email, and I used to play by email with a lot of these people. And yeah, they get really into it. It's not just about the battle itself. It's more about, the personalities of the different units and, what happens to them. And it's so easy to see how D&D came from tabletop wargaming, right? It's just like a natural extension of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that's what people like to observe about the Imperial Guard in 40K. It's like, those are the guys who can actually look at it and be like, I can see the battlefield from this perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay, so I want to ask you about the way that you value your professional work as in your work at the university versus your desire to work on your creative oeuvre. And so, like, what role does the creation of fiction play in your own personal, like, inner landscape? And how does that sync with or compete with your professional life?
Well, there is a bit of a kind of what do you call it? They both compete for my attention in the same way, in the sense that, when you're writing academic papers or books, you're using the same part of your brain that you are for writing like an RPG product. So there is definitely a trade-off to be made there, or a kind of like a butting of heads between the two different things. And I think, there's no point in lying about it. My boss is watching this, I'm sorry, but if I had the chance to, of course, I'd quit my work tomorrow and write RPG products for a living. I don't think that could ever happen, but I would do it if I could, because it's just more interesting, isn't it, to pursue what you can do. I think a lot of what I've realized lately, I think a lot of academics enter academia because they think that they can change the world in some way. They're not doing it because I love teaching's great, but most academics aren't entering the job because they really enjoy teaching. They're doing it because they think that they can make some dent in the universe. They can, especially nowadays, so many academics think of themselves as being like activists, kind of scholar activists, they call themselves. And I just increasingly think the best way that you can really change the world is to make things that people can enjoy, right? That seems to be the best thing that an individual person can possibly hope to achieve. Not being Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whoever else, a politician who you can name. But imagine being Charles Dickens, right? Imagine being, well, pick a name out of a hat. Imagine being George Lucas. Imagine being Christopher Nolan, right? You've created things that millions of people just get a huge amount of enjoyment out of. That's how I think most people really would like to change the world. If you really kind of like scratched under the surface, that's the real living the dream, if you know what I mean. And obviously you can't really do that writing like OSR products. Like, of course you can't, but you can do it in a very small, minor sort of a way, and certainly in a much more effective way than I can with my academic work. I don't know, no one cares two hoots really about anything I write in particular at work, but they might enjoy. More people probably will enjoy Yoon-Suin or whatever it is that I come out with. So that is where you get the real enjoyment from, and where you get real satisfaction from, I think, knowing that you've written something, people have bought it and people have used it and really enjoyed using it. So I'm very envious of the small number of people who've managed to kind of like make it for themselves as their careers, like Patrick, obviously, Patrick Stewart, James Radji, I suppose. I mean, they're very small number, isn't it? There's not many of them. But that being in that space is great, yeah, because you're entering into the realms of if not Charles Dickens, then at least you can you're entering in the realms of kind of authors, filmmakers. You're entering into that kind of category of person, and I think changing in the world in that way and just providing something that people can enjoy. It's just fabulous. That's great. Imagine if you could do that for a living.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, it does seem like the things that most bring life into the world are either like creative products or things like travel logs that people put together, anything that transports really, or steeps you in the knowledge of the human race or something like that. As in the the experience of our presence or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what I'm trying to say, but
yeah, no, I know. I think I know what you mean. I think either doing that or doing something that people really value and find useful. Like I think being a plumber, being an electrician, being a mechanic, at the other end of the spectrum, right? I think the problem is that most people are in the middle, where they're doing something which people don't particularly value and doesn't really have a creative kind of value to it either. It's just a kind of a nonsense job. A huge number of us do these just nonsense jobs, really. I think so. I think if you can get into either the world of being a plumber or an electrician, or being like a kind of Patrick Stewart, I think I would choose either of those. Not in the middle. I think in the middle is a bad place to be.
Yeah, completely. I definitely don't mean to discount. I mean, I have a day job. I don't mean to discount people who do the necessary work to support civilization.
Yeah.
At all. It's just the way that I'm pointed, the way that I'm
I know what you mean. Yeah.
It does seem to do it professionally. One has to first prepare themselves to accept poverty, at first.
Exactly. Yeah, I think so. Or unless you're somehow independently wealthy, or you win a lottery or something, Yeah, I do think I think like I did the calculations. I won't go into the figures exactly, but if I made 10 things that were as successful as Yoon-Suin, then I could probably support myself and my family at the level that we currently support ourselves. So yeah, I would have to make 10 things like that. And given that it took me like 3 or 4 years to produce, realistically, I'm never going to be in a position to do this, unless maybe once I've retired or something, but realistically, I'd never be able to do this full time.
Did you work on Yoon-Suin full time, or was it something?
No, So maybe I could do. Yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah, if I was doing it full time, I might be able to do things a bit more speedily. Yeah, because no, I wasn't working on it full time. It was just an hour a day or so. So, yeah. But I think you would have to take that initial hit, wouldn't you, of a couple of years of just having no money basically, or very little. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, there's always trade-offs. I mean, you get to have a family. It's like you don't have to worry about them being ground down by circumstance or something.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. And I think, do you know Nassim Taleb? Have you read any of Nassim Taleb's stuff? He, because a lot of what he writes about is obviously managing risk, isn't it? And kind of living, like I heard him describe it as, I think he called it convexivity, where you have there's no real possibility of downside, but there's a big possibility of upside. That's like the optimal position you can be in life, is where you're not really exposed to any downside risk, but you're exposed to a huge amount of upside possibility. And so he described Einstein. Like Einstein was in that position because he had no downside risk, because he had a completely safe job as a patent clerk, right? He was never going to lose that job. It was just a pen pushing kind of a job that kept him, gave him a salary, you could just live off that. But he was writing these papers that, could potentially have changed the world, well, one of those rare people who can actually change the world through academic endeavor, right? A huge possibility of upside. So if you can get into that kind of space where you've got a very safe job, like a sinecure almost, and you can, in your free time, you can just roll a dice and gamble on something, right? Then you're in that optimal point where you've got no downside, but you've got the potential, possibly, just possibly, what you do could be amazing. And I think maybe, a lot of writers are like that, right? They have these kind of like quite bog standard sort of a job, but in their spare time, like Stephen King, he's the high school teacher, but in his spare time writing Carrie, right? And suddenly Carrie takes off. He gets a $200,000 advance. Suddenly his life changes, right? And maybe J.K. Rowling as well, that kind of, just English teacher, writing in a cafe. You're relatively safe, you're just above poverty level, but then suddenly, something you do takes off. So, yeah. I mean, I don't think that would happen with an OSR product. I don't think like millions of people would buy something that you would do, but you can do it in a slightly more small scale sort of a way, right? Like you've got your normal job, but then you've got the possibility of doing something that a lot of people will buy and enjoy. And, it's extra cash, it's a fun thing to do. It enriches your life. So, yeah.
Yeah, completely. And you never know what kind of inspiration along the way might strike you, and then combine with the momentum, that you and then suddenly you've got something that's got wheels. Actually, that momentum post that you read, I've read that a few times. I think you're absolutely right about that. And as a result, I think I've written almost every day since then. That was a big piece of like context. God, there's one other thing I mentioned.
Well, while you've got that thought, before you ask that question, does that you just jog my memory of something I read when I was a little kid that did influence me? Because kind of going back full circle to what we were talking about at the start of this interview. I read a book when I was probably about 11 or 12 about how to be a science fiction writer, because I had it in my mind that I wanted to be a writer. So I read this book from the library by a writer called Ben Bova. Have you heard of him? He's like a science fiction writer from the USA, but he started the book by saying that a lot of people come to him and say that, like creative writing workshops, and they'll say, "Oh, I want to be a writer. Have you got any advice?" And he said the only advice he ever gives is, if you want to be a writer, write. Yeah, a writer writes. So if just write, just write every day, then that's 90% of what a writer does. So just do that. Why are you pussyfooting around it, in a sense? Why beat around the bush? Just write every day. And Stephen King as well, in his book on writing, he kind of argues that too. Just sit down and write. Every day. It might be rubbish, but you just get into the habit of it, and anything that you do habitually, you get better at.
Yeah, I've read a few books that you and Patrick have put on your blogs. I think I actually did read On Writing by Stephen King as a result of that. Yeah, definitely. If you just keep at it, you can look back and see what needs to happen. It helps to get eyes on. I have a friend, Dan Sullivan, who looks over stuff that I do, and you can look at it and identify exactly what the problem is, and you can sense, right? You can sense that there's a problem.
Yeah,
but having to get eyes on it is like having the clouds part, and just shines a spotlight on it. When you're writing Yoon-Suin, did you have anybody doing editing, or did you just?
No, I didn't. I think I was just lucky, but I also think because it's not a novel, I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right when it comes to most forms of writing. Yeah, I think that's true. I think perhaps Yoon-Suin's a bit unique in the sense that a lot of the writing is just these tables, isn't it? But there is a way that you can do that yourself, which is what I always tell students to do when they're writing work. You know, write something, write a draft of it, put it in a drawer for 2 weeks, a month, come back to it, and you'll read it like a third party. You know, it'll be like a fresh pair of eyes, and you can often identify the problems then. So if you've got no one who can read something you're writing, then just doing it yourself in that way can help. But it's why editors are really important, right? And why, you know, editors are really underrated. And I think that a lot of modern writing is terrible because books just don't get edited properly anymore. You know, look at A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, the first like 2 or 3 volumes of it have obviously been really tightly edited, and they're really, really good. But as the books got more famous, you know, as the TV series took off, no one's editing George R.R. Martin anymore. You know, so he can just write whatever he wants, and so he writes these 1,000-page long. I mean, what do you call them? And then they're just like drivel. I mean, there's good bits in them. You know, if they were like half the length, they'd be fantastic. But, you know, he's like writing page after page, describing like, you know, oh, here's what Tyrion ate for breakfast. You know, it's just like, you know, he just needs someone to tell him no, you know, just like get a red pen and just like cross it out, you know.
This is this concept that for a writer, words are the enemy or something like that.
As exactly. Yeah.
You know, every single one's got to carry its own weight. I'm fucking guilty of not always hearing that. But if I ever really release anything, it's got to be like, I'm going to take the fucking sword to that shit and just.
Well, okay, on that point then, because I do have to go in about 5 minutes. So let's ask you then. So what are you working on then? Because are you making something at the moment, or what's your plan in terms of publishing something?
Oh well, shoot. Criminy sakes. Okay. Well, I got a few like irons in the fire stuff that I work on. That, you know, it's like if you like to do creative output, your attention kind of goes like.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And, there's one thing I've been doing that I call wormling, as in WYRMLI, the brain parasite RPG. And the idea is, it's a space. It's like a space sci-fi thing where there's a great golden serpent in the center of the galaxy that periodically spawns little groups of brain parasites, little hard-shelled groups of brain parasites that float through space and land on plants and stuff like that, and go in and take over the bodies of people or creatures, aliens, what have you, and gradually go through stages, or not gradually, it can be almost instantaneous, where you're either hiding in a body and just observing as they go about the thing, or you can take over motor functions, you know, but the person's like, what the fuck is going on? You know, you can take over the brain, but when you fully take over the brain, you inhabit them, you can use their skills, use their memories, whatnot, but that kills them. So the personality's gone. And then the last stage, when you're done with that body, or if it's irreparably damaged or something like that, you eat the brain, calories from it, and you have a chance of gaining their skills. You have a chance of gaining their skills. So over time, your little wormling character develops.
Right. I get you. Okay.
They can be like advanced civic skills, military skills, social skills, whatever the brains that they eat.
So they're a bit like those things in Star Trek, the Jadzia Dax, a tiny bit like that, like, but you know, obviously much more violent and kind of involuntary. So yeah, you're kind of like your personality continues, but it kind of accretes new qualities and new. Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. That's quite cool. I like that. Yeah.
It's like information downloading in the Matrix or something like that. But you and then the other thing is the Starling and Strike RPG, which is like weird fiction, hard-boiled detective stuff. You know, I put out stuff for that occasionally. So we'll see. The idea is just when I have enough material, one particular basket for something that is publishable, then I might go. But for the moment, I'm just like accreting as much material as I can that I think is worthwhile. And then when the time, I'll take a big basket, pare down everything that doesn't support the value of it. Maybe get some art. I know that that's time consuming, and put it forward. And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think times have changed in a sense that you have to get very good at publicizing yourself now in a way that you didn't. When I was writing Yoon-Suin, I was lucky that there was G plus, and that was pretty much it, right? That was where everybody was, and everybody saw it once you release something. Whereas now that doesn't happen so much. So, but I think the kind of flip side of that is there's loads and loads and loads of really cool stuff getting produced, and a big market now. And the market feels like it's growing all the time. More and more people are reading things. More and more people are buying things. So it's kind of, yeah, it's exciting though for that reason. Yeah.
Well, if I was to do it, I wouldn't neglect publicizing it. Like I would probably get some Facebook advertising or something like that.
Yeah.
Something that can has a lot of reach.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just because if you're going to do it, like, why not? I don't care if I make a profit, on it. I'd rather just get it out there and get it. Get it if it's good and if they find it worthwhile. So on a similar, just before we go, can I ask you briefly about the fixed world?
Right. Okay.
Going forward on that.
Yeah. So, well, that's just something I'm going to do. Well, the idea of that is just, for people who don't know, it's just the idea is that there's a world which is flat and it's underneath the sun, and the sun doesn't move in the sky, right? So, where it's the morning, it's always the morning. Where it's noon, it's always noon. And obviously, the further away from the planet you are from being directly underneath the sun, the closer you are to winter, right? So, it might be always winter and always nighttime. It might be always winter and always daytime, and so on. So, so that's the basic conceit behind it. And the idea was just to make something using the monsters in the monstrous manual that don't get used very much, and putting a different spin on them. So instead of having like, so partly it's using monsters like the things like deadly puddings or like rust monsters or what are the other things, arcanes or Arakocra, just like the weird things that never really get the kind of like spotlight in the traditional kind of TSR campaign setting. So it's kind of giving them some love. And the existing monsters like the orcs, hobgoblins and things, make them into like animal versions of themselves, hence going back to the animal men. So instead of orcs, yeah, exactly, you get here in this part of the world, there are orcs who have the heads of puffins. Here in this part of the world, the orcs have the heads of bison, whatever it might be, so just kind of like putting a new spin on the old monsters. So yeah, and I'm just going to put that out because that partly was born of frustration of not finding anyone who can do art or can do it reliably. I just thought I'll do it with them without art. So it's just maps and tables, and each product will be about 40 or 50 pages. But I'm kind of going to do some other things as well because I feel like I've got free reign to do whatever I want with it. So I'm not going to just kind of map out the world bit by bit. I'm going to do some adventures, some dungeons, some like the next one is going to be a city, which happens to be at the point where there are 4 kind of intersections between different times of day and different seasons. So it's a city, but it's got 4 quarters, and each quarter, in one quarter, let's see if I can get this right. So in the bottom quarter, it's always winter and always the night. In the quarter up from that, it's always winter and always the evening. In that quarter, it's always the autumn and always the evening. And in the bottom corner, it's always the autumn and always the nighttime. I think. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, it's like that kind of design. So it's going to be a game set in that, or it's a setting rather, a mini setting, if you like, in that city. And the idea is there's 4 quarters, but the name of the prod is going to be the 5th quarter, because underneath the city there is a place where they all come together. So people from the different quarters kind of congregate underneath the city, and that's the 5th quarter. So I'm just going to come up with all different ideas and just kind of put them on the website as and when they come available for a small fee. It's just something kind of something extra to do. But I've got other things as well. I've got bigger products as well, but this is kind of more like just something to put out for fun, really, just as another creative outlet. And hopefully more rapidly than like I say, the big products can take years and years and years and years. So these don't have to take years and years. So yeah. and I'll just put, you know, you can, if you want to find out about them, I'll just put them on the, they'll be on the blog, and then, you know, I'll advertise them on Reddit or whatever as well, and people can download them.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot, David. This was a lot of fun. Very, very.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the interview. It was great. Yeah, and maybe we can do it again. We can do like a return on once you've done the brain parasite game. We can do like a
sure. Well,
we'll do a return interview. Let's do it.
Living in here by that point.
Yeah, yeah. Cool.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna hit the button. I'd love to talk again.
Yeah, that'd be great. Absolutely.